Hi, everyone, and welcome to Super STEM. I'm so excited to be here with you today. And many thanks go out to the North Kingstown Free Library and the Young Readers Program for making this possible. I truly appreciate the collaboration, and I'm so excited to get to know more about the world with you over these next several videos. So, I am Alaina Minerick. I'm a high school graduate, and I'm going to study chemistry in college next year. And I am a supreme science enthusiast. I love science, and I'm so excited to get to explore several topics with you over these next couple of days. So, I thought to start, it would be great to take a look at building, particularly buildings and the work that architects do, designing different structures and constructing them, because it involves a combination of creativity and practicality and consideration of scientific laws that generally well represents the field of study in science. Because in order to make progress in science, you have to understand these principles that have already been established, but you also have to think outside the box sometimes. And working on building, which we're going to be doing today, is a good way to sort of combine those skills and just take a look into what it's like to be a scientist. So, there are buildings all throughout the world, and they all look so different, but they all have things in common. These architects were creative and made these structures look unique, totally unique. Like, many buildings don't even really look similar to each other at all, but they had similar things in mind. And so we're going to take a look first at some of the variety that you see among buildings to see how creative these architects can get. And here we are. So you may recognize these buildings, you may not, but the one on the left is Big Ben, and that is a famous clock tower in London, England. And it's been standing for quite a long time now. On the right, there are some more what we would call contemporary buildings made of glass and metal, and they look very, very different from Big Ben. But what they have in common is that they're functional and sturdy and are going to stand for a long time. And here's some other views of these buildings. Here's the Shard here. That's what we call this pointy, tall building in London. And then Big Ben is over here down to the right. And here's Westminster Abbey, which is also in London, which is another quite old building that was built well so that it's both beautiful and functional for many, many years. And here is a view of France. Perhaps you recognize this tower to the right. That is the Eiffel Tower, which is one of the most iconic buildings in Paris. Although, fun fact, when it was first built, a lot of people thought that it was so ugly and wanted to get rid of it. But here's a neat view from under it looking up. But it's so different from Big Ben and the other buildings I just showed you, and that it has such a unique shape and appearance. But like the other buildings I showed you, it's functional. The architects who built it took into account that people would be going up on it and that it needed to be stable and sturdy. And so you can see all of these metal rafters and scaffolding to make sure that the Eiffel Tower does not fall over. And so here are some other buildings from Europe that are pretty neat. Here's a bell tower in Venice and a bell tower in Florence, Italy. And here are some buildings from New York City, such as the Metropolitan Opera and the Rockefeller Center. So I'm showing you all of these buildings just to give you an idea of how creative and outside the box architects can go. Perhaps they're limited by rules that they have to follow. They have to obey the laws of gravity and make sure that they're safe and functional. But there's really a lot that you can do to add some unique flair to these buildings. If you take a look here to the right, it's the Eiffel Tower, but it's built out of macarons. Um, and the person who built that had to take into account some of the same factors that the people who built this building on the left did, even though, they're on a very different scale and different materials. And so I just think it's really neat to see how creative these architects can get, obeying both the laws of science, but also being artistic at the same time. And that's, as I said before, a big part of being a scientist. You have to think outside of the box if you want to make scientific progress, but you also have to obey some laws that are already present. It's a balance of practicality and artistry. So, on the practicality side, architects who built all of these buildings have to take into account the fact that gravity is constantly pulling things down. You probably are aware that when you drop something, it's going to just fall right toward the ground. Um, that's just the nature of Earth's gravity will pull things in. And even super large buildings made of stone are being subject to gravitational pull. And so when architects build these buildings, they have to make sure that they're stable and balanced to make sure that gravity doesn't just pull them over, because that would be catastrophic. But just to illustrate what I mean, if you try standing on one foot, you'll find that you're a lot more unstable and more likely to fall toppling over than if you were to stand on 2 feet, because you're off balance and you aren't solid. You don't have a solid foundation and your weight is unequally distributed. But when you have your feet spread out far apart, that is much greater assurance. It's much harder to knock you over. And architects take similar things into account when constructing these buildings. So here are two famous structures. You might recognize the one on the left as the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and it doesn't really look like it's leaning that much in that picture because I took it from a strange angle, but the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and this is inside the Pantheon in Rome. Both of these structures, which are so beautiful and so historically significant, they both are good examples of some of the practicality or conventions that architects have to keep in mind when building things. So the Leaning Tower of Pisa, why exactly does it lean? Well, it didn't originally lean when it was first built. It was actually standing straight up. So the architects didn't really particularly do anything wrong. It's just that, well, one of the important parts of constructing a building is making sure that it's on a strong foundation, that it's on solid ground so that it doesn't tip over. And they didn't exactly do that with the Leaning Tower of Pisa. You see, if you were standing on a solid rock, you would stay standing upright. But the Leaning Tower of Pisa, part of it is on solid ground, but the architects didn't realize that, well, half of it was on this much looser ground, sand and clay and whatnot. And so, if you were standing with one foot on a rock and another foot in mud, the foot in the mud is going to sink and you're going to fall over. And that's basically what happened with the Leaning Tower of Pisa. The end that was on top of soft ground sank, causing the whole tower to just tilt. And it's actually become more tilted over the years. So that is why you need to have a strong foundation. And now, this dome in the Pantheon in Rome is really intricate looking, very lovely, and carved in such a complicated way. And maybe it's to make it look pretty, but they also serve a functional purpose. Um, let's say that you were trying to hold up a bunch of rocks in an arch over your head. That would be very difficult if they were heavy. And although you might be pushing up and like squeezing them together to really try to keep them together and up over your head, if they're heavy, that's just not gonna work for a while. So this is kind of was what the architects were considering when they were building the Pantheon. They realized, oh, all this stone in this dome, that's going to be really heavy and eventually it's going to fall. So they actually carved out all of these little squares to make it much lighter. And the result is both functional and quite pretty as well. So, you know, some of these buildings really give good examples of some of the factors you have to take into account when building. And as I showed before, you can get pretty creative with the materials you use to build and whatnot. And so I thought that it would be a fun challenge to try to create our own buildings using index cards. Obviously, these aren't actual buildings that you would be able to go inside, they'd just be models. But it's just a fun, simple way to start to consider gravity and balance and having a strong foundation and whatnot. And so I challenge you to try to build the tallest tower you can. You will have 12 index cards, which I have here, and some tape. And using these materials, you can actually build a good many different variety of structures. One of my tips, though, is that you tape down your tower so that it doesn't fall over. Because all buildings are fastened to the ground and all the parts are fastened together, because if they weren't, then they would blow over and it would be a mess. So the index cards pretty much represent your wood, your metal, the materials that you would use to construct a building. And the tape is your screws and nails, the things that hold these buildings together to make sure that they don't fall apart. So I challenge you to try building your own tower using these materials and just see what you can come up with. You can be creative, you can do whatever you want. And afterward, I will show you something interesting that I discovered kind of works by experimenting my own sort of tower design. So if you would like, you can pause and try building something out of these materials. And you can also use scissors or fold the cards. There's really no limit to what you can do. So go ahead. And hopefully you have built something at this point. I'm sure that whatever you have created is absolutely amazing. But I am going to show you something that I myself have found to be a good demonstration of some of the forces and factors that come into play when building things. So for my tower, I'm going to be rolling up these index cards. And I will tape down this one at the bottom. Just to make sure it stays. And now I'm going to continue to roll the other cards. And stack them, kind of like a telescope, putting one inside the last so that there's some overlap. Now, you might see something interesting going on, especially considering that I did not use tape to secure the second card to the first. I'm rolling up these cards and putting them into each other like a telescope. And well, somehow they're not falling over, even though they're not fastened together. And well, there's actually an explanation for that. But this is just my own tower design. Here we go. But what's interesting about this structure is that it's taped at the bottom, but everything else is loose. You could easily knock it over, but it's staying. It's staying stacked. And that's because I've rolled these index cards into little tubes, as you can see. But when you try rolling up a piece of paper or an index card or something stiff, it kind of wants to unroll. It won't stay in a tight little tube. It kind of begins to come apart. And so it sort of pushes out. And if you try to put an additional tube within that one, the one within is pushing out on the outer tube, and that creates a frictional force that prevents the top tube from sliding down. There's this sort of friction between this tube and this tube because this one is pushing out on this one. And so there's some force there keeping them together. And well, they're light enough. These are paper, so they're light enough to stay together. If you tried to do something similar with stone, which is super heavy, I do not think that it would work. But paper is so light that the frictional force, or the force that's kind of preventing this tube from sliding down, is much greater than the weight of this paper and the gravitational pull that would pull it down, which I find to be very interesting. And hopefully you do as well. It's kind of neat how you don't really need to secure them. They just stay because the frictional force between them just keeps them together. But of course, you would not want to try using this strategy when building an actual building because if you flick them, they go flying. Because paper is very light, and if you don't secure it, it's going to fall. So that is a kind of tower that an architect would probably not want to build, but it is a fun little demonstration of some various forces that come into play when constructing buildings. So I think that's so cool. I was just experimenting and then found that out as I was doing. I was like, hey, I don't need to tape these together. They're just staying because the friction is enough to hold them. But as a real architect building real buildings, you have to use screws and nails to make sure that all the materials and pieces stay together because people are going to be in those buildings and you need them to be safe and secure. So that is just a fun little challenge. I hope that you had fun with that and maybe learned a little something as well. So I hope that you learned something from this, and I hope you realize that with science, it's not all just following rules and I don't know, following regulations. There is a lot of thinking outside of the box. It's an art in its own way. And architecture is an area of science that really demonstrates that really well, the balance between being practical and being creative. And so hopefully you got to exercise both some creativity and some practical thinking as you were building your paper constructions, because you had to be creative about how you would build it, but then you also had to be creative about what it looked like, but then you were also trying to make sure that it didn't fall over. And, maybe you weren't being super planning it out super well or being really methodical about it. Like, you probably didn't feel like you were being an architect, but there's just some of those instincts that you had trying to make sure that it stayed upright and, making the little fixes to make sure that the tower didn't topple over. That's actually for some pretty impressive scientific thinking. You were really thinking like an architect with building towers out of these pieces of paper. Who would have known? So that I hope you can take some pride in that. And that's pretty much all that I had for today. Just taking a little look at some engineering and building. And as we go on, we'll take a look at some different topics. And by the end, I hope that you'll feel like you know a little bit more about the world and are more excited about science, because that is the ultimate goal. I think science is so amazing, and I would really like for you to find that as well. So thank you so much for joining me. I really had a great time going through buildings and constructing paper towers, and I hope that you'll join me in the next video. Have a great day.